physics. And this is a very important topic, primarily because of the fact that science and this subject called metaphysics are two things that definitely impact on our lives. It's interesting to note how many of us are affected by scientific discoveries that have been made that have the ability to improve the quality of our lives. But at the same time, many of the scientists who spend a great deal of their lives doing research and developing theories and products are of the notion that science is the highest form of existence, that the people who are able to create these devices, the televisions and the VCRs and the space shuttles, are the most brilliant individuals that have ever existed on this planet. That the science and technology that exists today has taken us to the highest plateau that man has ever existed on this planet. And that's not true. It's not true at all, particularly when you're able to study the history of mankind, particularly from an Afrocentric perspective. And when you do that, you find that in many ways we are very primitive compared to some of the ways of the ancients. We have to begin to understand what the differences are. We have to also begin to understand what are those aspects that we can begin to incorporate in our lives, which will allow us to become the best people possible.
Anthony T. Browder opens his lecture on comedic sciences and metaphysics by challenging the modern notion that laboratory science is the highest form of knowing simply because it produces useful tools. He argues that in crucial ways, we are more primitive than our African ancestors in Kemet, who lived in conscious alignment with nature's cycles and the unseen and spiritual dimensions of reality. For Browder, Kemetic knowledge was not merely technical. It was wisdom aimed at cultivating balance within the individual and the community, so that technology served humanity in cosmic harmony rather than replacing it. From there, Browder critiques Eurocentric scientific narratives that once insisted the original man was European, ideas echoed in popular imagery of Adam and Eve as white. He urges audiences to consult mitochondrial DNA research, which traces matrilineal lineages back to deep African origins, to reframe the story of human beginnings. In this telling, genetics support the long-standing African-centered claim that humanity's earliest ancestors were African, and that the dispersion of human populations outward came later. This genetic perspective, he argues, helps correct distortions that have long undercut African people's place in the human story.
Last year, Newsweek magazine had on its cover this particular story, The Search for Adam and Eve. It's in the November 11th issue of Newsweek magazine. And this story is important because it dealt with a very controversial theory, as they describe here on the cover of this magazine. It's also important too because the story originally came out in in January of 1987. But it didn't make the cover of Newsweek until January of 1988. And just recently, in October of 1989, it also was presented again in USA Today. So this story keeps coming out, and what's so interesting is the results of a finding of scientists, biologists at the University of California at Berkeley, and also biologists at London University, who did a study of a cross-section of people, studied the mitochondrial DNA of a cross-section of people from all over this planet, and they came to one conclusion, and that is that every man, woman, and child on this planet has one common denominator. That is the mitochondrial DNA that links them to an African woman. In other words, every person on this planet is of African descent, genetically. Like, that has biologically been proven. So that's one good thing about science that we can applaud right now. That is that they finally came to a conclusion that African people stated hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, that African people were the first people on the planet. So then, as science begins to unlock some doors for us, it allows us the opportunity to look back at statements and discoveries that were made by our ancestors, and to see the validity of those statements. One of the most profound things that our ancestors studied and understood was that man was a model of the universe. The old adage, as above, so below, those things that exist outside of this planet also exist on this planet and within man. Man is a reflection of the universe. And to the degree that a person is able to understand himself or herself is the same degree that that person will be able to understand the workings of the universe. They are directly connected. They are not separated or isolated. If man understands this knowledge of himself, the knowledge of the universe, then we find that he will also begin to understand other aspects of knowledge and information that will help to expand your level of awareness. Much of this information can be found in the study of astronomy, astrology, mathematics, medicine, symbolism, spirituality, and religion, as well as architecture. And when you study the development of man in ancient Kemet, you find that all of these aspects were incorporated in the ancient Nile Valley civilizations. If we look at the development of man, scientists said that mankind and civilization began in Africa. So if we look at that, if we accept that reality and look at the literature, we'll find that the ancient Kemetians had a word, Africa, which meant the birthplace, which literally meant the birthplace of mankind, the birthplace of culture and civilization. And those of you who have had an opportunity to read some of the works of Diop, who talks about the two cradle theory of man, or have had an opportunity to hear Dr. Edwin Nichols talk about the axiological references between the different types of people that inhabit this planet, you can begin to understand how the various races came about. How if mankind began in Africa, and as these African people began to migrate to different parts of the planet, they began to adapt to changes in the environment. Moving into a colder environment, they began to wear more clothing, more animal skins, which insulated their skin from the sunlight. They began to get gradually lighter and lighter. In a colder environment, their facial features would constrict. The noses would become smaller, the lips would become thinner, their hair would become lighter and straighter to insulate the body. And eventually, over a period of years, a new race of people evolved. This has also been scientifically proven to be a fact. This is how the various races of people on this planet speciated or evolved because of a means of adapting to climatic conditions. So, if we understand that, and more specifically, if we understand what Dr. Nichols talks about in dealing with the axiological references between the European and the African, when the African was living in this tropical environment on the continent of Africa, most of his basic needs were taken care of. Food was easily accessible. Clothing was not a big concern. Shelter was easily made, so that with having the bare necessities of life already met, they can begin to focus their attention on the development of their mind, the development of their intellect. They can begin to study their surroundings and benefit from accumulating this knowledge. One of the things that they saw is that they saw a direct connection, a direct correlation between the sources of creation and them being able to benefit from that. In other words, the creator or whatever these forces of creation were seemed to have blessed these people by giving them an abundance of food, clothing, and shelter. But those Africans who migrated to the north, who settled in Europe, in a harsh or cold environment, found that they had to struggle for their existence. Found that food was not as plentiful. They had to learn how to grow the food. They found that there were only basically 3 months out of the year in which to plant the food. After the food was planted, they had to be able to harvest the food. After the food was harvested, they had to be able to store the food and to protect the food from other people who didn't have it. They had to also defend themselves from the elements, from the cold, defend themselves from other people who didn't have what they had. So that began to develop a more aggressive mindset within these people. These people also saw nature as something that they had to do battle with on a continual basis. They saw nature as something that they had to conquer. So this idea of them surviving because they were forced to do battle against the elements, and only, as they said, only the strong survived. Only those who had the strength or the wits were able to survive and make it from one year to the next. And these people eventually became the more powerful people because they evolved to become more aggressive. So you have two basic mindsets. Giap talks about this two cradle theory, this two cradle concept, and how you have one people in the South who have a more genteel mindset, who live in harmony with nature. You have another group of people in the North who are more aggressive and are forced by their environment to see nature as an enemy and something that has to be conquered. So then, as these two groups of people began to develop their various cultures and civilizations, they saw nature from two different perspectives. They developed two different types of sciences, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. The definition of science is that science comes from the word sere, which means to know. So when we talk about the development of science, the very beginning of development of science, we're talking about people who began to gather knowledge just from observing those things that went on around them. And they began to record that information, they documented that information, and then they passed it on from one generation to the next. In ancient Kemet, we find the earliest examples of the development of sciences, and that one of the first sciences to develop was the science of astronomy. And that is, when people have their basic requirements of life met, they'll often sit down and watch the movement of the sun. They watch the movement of the stars across the sky at night. They'll watch the moon go through its metamorphosis. Those of you who came here this evening, if you noticed the moon, you saw a new crescent moon, and right next to that moon was a star, was Venus, actually, a planet, Venus. And if you observe that moon every night, you're going to see the moon begin to get bigger and bigger. And then you're going to see the moon reach a point where it's going to start to get smaller and smaller. And then the cycle will begin all over again. So to the people who were seeing this for the first time, this truly amazed them. And as you watch this, you can see a pattern unfolding before your very eyes. And that planet Venus, which is in close proximity to the new moon, is going to change its position every day. So they can see everything around them is moving. The sun moves in the sky. Everything around them is in motion. So that automatically begins to capture your interest. And by observing these changes, they began to learn some very phenomenal things. The ancient Egyptians knew of the movement of the moon. They knew of the phases of the moon. They knew of at least 5 planets. And the word planet comes from a Latin word which means wanderer. So the planets were those stars that appeared to wander across the heavens, didn't seem to maintain a fixed position in the sky. They wandered from one point to the next. And they saw this difference. There was a discernible difference between these balls of light that stayed in the same configuration like some of the constellations that we see, and then other balls of light that appeared to wander across the sky. So by observing this phenomena and then by recording this phenomena, they began to see a cause and effect relationship between the position of certain stars or planets in the sky and something that occurred on the planet below. It was through understanding and cataloging these events that the science of astrology evolved. And those of you who have read John Jackson's Introduction to African Civilization will see in that book, he describes how the various stellar configurations were given their symbolic associations with animals, because the position of those stars in the sky reflected certain activities that took place on the earth associated with agriculture. So if we look at the beginning or the development of agriculture, we see that it's directly related to the understanding of man to the movement of stars in the sky. They would learn that there were certain times when you could plant your seeds based on the position of the moon or the phase of the moon and the position of certain stars in the sky. And it's been said in a number of historical books that the first farmers, the first people to develop the science of agriculture were the women. And that it was the women who oftentimes were in the home, who were tending the children while the men may have been out hunting or doing some other things. It was the women who really had the time to observe the movements of the sun and the stars. It was also women who saw a profound relationship between one of the most important bodies in the sky and themselves, that is the moon. The women saw that the moon would undergo a metamorphosis, a phase, just as they would undergo a metamorphosis, a phase, a 28-day cycle. And that cycle was the same as the cycle of the moon. So that when they began to catalog this information, they began to catalog this information in association with the stellar systems that they saw. They began to develop lunar calendars that were based on 13th month, which is associated to the various phases of the moon. There was a solar calendar of 365 and a quarter days. There also were stellar calendars that were based on the position of certain stars and certain constellations in the heavens. So they had three distinct ways of plotting and clocking the movements of events in the heavens and activities that also took place on the planet Earth. One very good example of this process as it relates to agriculture is the significance of the star Sirius. Sirius was referred to as the dog star. The star Sirius would rise, this is around June 21st. Around June 21st, the star Sirius would rise just before sunrise, and this would signal the annual flooding of the Nile. It was the annual flooding of the Nile that made possible life in Kemet, because it was the annual flooding of the Nile which brought a new layer of silt, a new deposits of soil to the east and the west bank of the Nile. And they saw this phenomena occur on an annual basis. When you would have the heliacal rising of this star Sirius, or when this star Sirius rose just before the sun did, and it only occurred during one time of the year, the flooding of the Nile always came after it. So Sirius on one hand was referred to as the dog star, and that symbolically one of the things that a dog does or a watchdog does is to warn you when somebody or something is coming. So these symbols, the association of symbols with these stars was very important, was very significant. And one of the other things that the ancestors did when they began to plot the movement of these stars and star systems was to develop a calendar. And this calendar, of 365 and a quarter days, was associated with symbols which they called netters. And the netters represented principles or concepts of the various sources of creation. There were 36 netters in total, 18 male and 18 female. And each of these netters were associated with certain star systems or constellations in the heaven. And each of these netters were given dominion or rule over a 10% portion of the sky. In other words, one of the things that our ancestors did was to divide the sky into a circle which had a circumference of 360 degrees. And 10 degrees was given to each of the 36 decans, or 36 netters. 36 netters having 10 degrees each within this circle of 360 degrees would give you 360 days. And 5 additional days were associated to the netters who were responsible for giving birth to these other 36 netters. so that each day was associated with a principle which reflected an aspect of the Creator. They were able to not only divide the year up into segments, but they also divided the day up into segments. The day was associated with several of the sun deities, Horus being one, Ra or Re being the other. Re was one of the terms for one of the more popular deities or gods in Kemet. And it's from the word Re that we've gotten the term a ray of light. It refers to this ancient African concept of the deity symbolized by the sun. And then you have another manifestation of the sun when it was in another position in the sky, in which it was associated with the deity Set. Set represents the forces of darkness, symbolically the forces of darkness, which is where we have derived the word sunset, where the sun goes when it disappears from the horizon. These are symbolic terms that express the relationship of the sun relative to the earth. And Clyde, if you can you bring me a copy of my book back here for a second? I wanted to make a couple of references. Also, what's important too is understanding how the ancients, in plotting the movements of the sun, the stars, and the moon, were able to develop not only the first calendar, not only the first calendar, but also the first clock, the first timekeeping mechanism. They devised the second, the minute, and the hour as a means of keeping track of this movement. And as I stated on several occasions, the word hour is derived from the word Horus. Let me just read you a couple of things from my book in the chapter Paying Homage to the Sun about the significance of the sun. The sun is 93 million miles away, yet it exerts the most powerful force on the planet. It is the radiant day star which gazes down upon us from the heavens and is a giver of all life. It has been the oldest and most common object of worship in the history of mankind. It is the sun. All living things hunger for the light and the warmth of the sun that falls on us like a blanket of love. The first day of the week was named in honor of it. The second day of the week, Monday, means the day of the moon, which is illuminated by the sun. The lengthening of the days and nights during the course of the year are the hallmarks of our 4 seasons. The spring and fall equinox signal a time of equal day and equal night on the planet. The summer and winter solstices represent the longest and shortest days of the year, respectively. For over 5,000 years, people have acknowledged the sun as a symbol of goodness, strength, and spiritual rebirth. The sun is the power behind the process of photosynthesis, the means by which plants grow, animals feed on the energy-enriched plants, and man uses both plants and animals for food, shelter, and clothing. The sun evaporates water from rivers, lakes, oceans, which form clouds, and water falls from these clouds as rain or snow. Clouds are visible bodies of fine droplets of water or particles of ice dispersed in the atmosphere, which change the temperature and air pressure, thus influencing the weather on the earth below. After each rainstorm or snowstorm, the sun shines brightly to repeat the cycle and draw the water back up into the clouds. If the sun stopped shining, all life on the planet would cease as we know it. The air would freeze and the earth would become nothing more than an empty waste ball of rock drifting endlessly through space. The relationship that exists between the earth and the sun is such a fine and delicate relationship that if the sun was any closer or any further away than it is, then all life would perish. So this relationship was something that our ancestors saw, understood, and later associated with this system that was called religion. So that one very important reality that we have to understand as the first forms of science evolved was that the science of time, understanding what time it was, understanding the various phases of the sun, the moon, knowing when certain ceremonies were to begin was very important. Everything that we do is a result of this important relationship that revolves around time. So a point that I've made over and over again is that time is something that we cannot take for granted. Many of us tease and make fun of black folk, and the particular time reference that black folks have, we call it CP time. Colored people are always late, don't do things on time. And when you deal with the universe, you have to be on time. If the sun didn't rise when it was supposed to rise, it would throw everything off. If Sirius didn't rise when it was supposed to rise, it would throw everything off. If the moon didn't go through its phases when it was supposed to, it would throw everything off. Everything operates on a precise time frame. And that time frame is something that is very important for us as African people if we are to begin to understand where we are and truly understand where it is that we're supposed to go. There's also a radio station right here in the Washington area, in Alexandria, I believe, a radio station called WCPT, W Colored People's Time, that plays nothing but oldies. You know, so we have a habit of making fun of something that is very serious, but it's also something that we need to be very cognizant of. I want to talk about symbols and symbolic thought and the importance of them. Symbols are carefully chosen from the natural world, or the netters. And each symbol chosen is that which best expresses or represents a function or a principle. All of the symbols that were chosen were symbols that were associated, in many instances, to animals, were symbols that were associated to qualities or aspects of animals that were significant. I cited the Sirius symbolism as one. So a symbol therefore represents a specific principle or function on all levels simultaneously, from the simple, most obvious manifestation to the most abstract metaphysical form. Horus as a symbol that is associated with the sun is important because one of the symbols for Horus was the falcon. The eye of Horus is a symbol that represented the sun. The eye of Horus is a symbol that is also a symbol that is associated with God, the primary deity, in that God, like the sun, stands over the planet and is able to see and influence everything on the planet below. Anubis was a symbol Anubis was the jackal in ancient Commission symbolism, a symbol that was associated with the scene of judgment. Anubis was the animal or the jackal who represents the qualities of fine judgment, because of qualities that are inherent to the characteristics of a jackal. The serpent is a very important symbol that we see repeated over and over again in ancient Kemet. The serpent is an animal or creature that has a forked tongue. The serpent also has a forked penis. The serpent also has this process of shedding its skin, so that aspects of the serpent came to represent this quality called duality. The ability to exist on two levels, the ability to discriminate, and it was symbolic. The serpent was symbolic of a higher and a lower intellect, the duality between the two aspects of the intellect. So it's interesting to see how the serpent has been represented in recent times, in modern times. The serpent is a symbol associated with something that is evil, as opposed to something that represents the duality of the human intellect. The vulture is a symbol that was associated with the assimilation or the passing over to the afterworld. And if you've noticed on the symbol of the crown of the pharaoh, you see the pharaoh when he was alive would wear a crown that had the serpent on it. The serpent would reflect this intellect, or the dual aspects of the intellect. And after that pharaoh died, on all representations of that pharaoh, they would show the crown, the pharaoh wearing the crown, the serpent on it, and also the vulture. The vulture was symbolic of assimilation. Those two symbols were only shown together after the pharaoh had died. And once again, it's interesting to see how contemporary individuals misunderstand these symbols. Those of you who have ever seen the movie The Ten Commandments will notice in the movie, Yul Brynner, who supposedly represents the pharaoh Ramesses, wears throughout the entire movie the pharaonic crown that has the cobra and the vulture on it, a symbol that is associated with death. And that was primarily because they were taking the symbolism directly from the crown of King Tut, and they didn't understand what the symbols on that crown meant. So to have symbols and to not understand the essence behind the symbols means that the symbols don't have the power, they don't have the significance that they were supposed to have. But one of the very important things that we see that came out of the study of the heavens, the movement of the stars, the learning of time, was a science called mathematics. And it's through mathematics that they began to be able to further plot other relationships. Most of what is known about Egyptian mathematics comes from a papyrus that was made in the Middle Kingdom called the Rhine Papyrus. It was a papyrus that was a scroll that had mathematical problems and solutions on it that were made primarily for children. And on the basis of the study of this document, mathematicians and other theoreticians have come to the conclusions that the ancient Egyptians had a high understanding of mathematics through a study of some of their architectural structures. It's also obvious that they had a high understanding of calculus and geometry, things that we do not normally associate with African people. In dealing with the higher forms of math, we find that numbers were sometimes called the language of the absolute, in that everything that is a part of life can be expressed in some numerical form. Everything that is a part of life can be reduced to principles or frequencies of numbers. So therefore, numbers play very important roles. Even in computers, the computer systems that we have today are based on a binary system, and that is dealing with two very simple numbers, 0 and 1, which are symbolic of something being turned on and something being turned off. By dealing with these two very elementary numbers, you can develop some very complicated systems. Another important aspect of numbers can be associated with words. Words in ancient Kemet were seen as things that evoked power. If you look in the Bible, in Genesis, begins with the statement that in the beginning was the Word. And it talks about how God brought the world into existence via the spoken word. Let there be light, and there was light. Let there be earth, and there was earth. And then the animals came into existence via the spoken word. In ancient Egyptian documents, Ra also brings the world into existence via the same process. So this idea of the word and the power of the word is something that is very significant, in that when we look at ancient Commission writing, or their use of words, the metal netter, as opposed to the hieroglyphs. The word hieroglyphs is a Greek word which means sacred carvings. The metal netter is the writing or the words of the gods. Okay? And that in looking at the metal netter, whenever they wrote this language, they would always write the consonants and never the vowels. Okay? Always write the consonants. Those who were part of the priesthood and dealing with this language for specific purposes never wrote the vowels. And as the scientists began to study the science of words, or the science of languages, what they found is that consonants vibrate at a rate that is different from vowels. Vowels vibrate at a rate which is 500 times faster than consonants. And if you think about the consonants A, E, I, O, U, when you say them, when you say these letters A, E, I, O, U, a different effect is produced. Because when you use the consonants, your tongue blocks the flow of energy, or the flow of the breath through your mouth, except when you say the vowels A, E, I, O, U. So that symbolically, when they were writing the medu netters, or the language of the gods, the writing of the gods, it was, in essence, as though the consonants were symbolic of bricks that were used to create certain symbolic structures, and the vowels were the mortar which held these bricks together. In other words, you can build things, you can create things through using the physical substance of the consonants, but the power of the vowels are what brings them into manifestation. It's what supports them and gives them structure. And if you notice, there are no words in the English language that I know of, there are no words that don't contain vowels. So this symbolic essence is still there in the language today. If we look at medicine, the science of medicine, in Kemet, the nectar, and the word nectar is a word that we can use to describe God, if we will. The word nectar clearly identifies this whole process of the deity, and that it represents the principle of the manifestation of the primary deity. And in Kemet, the nectar associated with writing or speaking was the nectar called Jehudi. Jehudi was representative of the spoken word. It was the nectar associated with divine articulation of speech. It was the nectar associated with writing, with science, and with medicine. Jehudi is known to us today by the names Thoth, by the names Hermes, and the name Mercury. Imhotep is regarded as a father of medicine, and by studying ancient Commission history, we find that Imhotep incorporated a strong astrological belief in the practice of medicine, and that specific medicines were given at specific times to patients. I had an opportunity to really understand what this all meant a couple of years ago in 1985 when I went to Ethiopia and met an Ethiopian herbologist at the university in Addis. And this man was in the process of writing a book on herbs. And in this book, he showed us the treatment for various illnesses that he had treated with for some of the patients in Egypt. He had a number of photographs of people that had various forms of cancer, cancer of the throat, cancer on the legs and the arms. And these photographs were amazing. One particular photograph I remember, he showed a woman that had a cancerous growth on her neck, and her neck was the size of a grapefruit. In another photograph he showed us, the lump on the woman's neck was reduced to about the size of a marble. And in another photograph, you couldn't even tell that the woman had any cancer on the neck. So the before and after photographs were remarkable. And when we asked them, well, how long did it take this process, this healing process to occur? A year, 2 years, 3 years? He said, about 3 months. And the only thing he treated many of his patients with were herbs. And he began to talk about how he had learned the science of herbology from his father, and his father had learned it from his father before him. And that if we had had enough time, he would have taken us out with him to show us how he plants the herb, how he gathers the herb. But he was just telling us how, and you don't just go out and pick a particular plant that supposedly has certain qualities. You have to be able to know the qualities associated with the different plants. And he put out this list, this chart of at least 75 different plants. And he showed the properties of these different plants and the different ailments that it would cure. He then went on to say that a plant that would heal a particular ailment at one time of the year may cause a particular problem at another time of the year. So you had to know exactly when to pick these plants, because the energy of the life-giving properties of the plant will be at one level in the spring and will be at another level in the fall. He also mentioned that the soil that the plants grew in was important as well, because the plants would take in certain nutrients and certain minerals that are in the soil. So therefore, you would want to pick certain plants that grew at a certain level of a mountain. Certain plants you want to, certain herbs or certain plants you want to pick at the bottom of the mountain. Certain other herbs you would want to pick midway of the mountain. And other herbs you want to pick at the very top of the mountain. So as he began to explain what I thought was a very simple process, I began to see how very complicated, how deeply involved this process was, and he had showed us how this knowledge and information had been passed on from generation to generation. One of the important things that he mentioned specifically about the herbs is their ability to work on one specific part of the body, and that part of the body alone.
Browder then returns to the core Kemetic principle, the correspondence between the human being and the universe. What composes the cosmos composes the person. Therefore, to know the self is to know the universe. Mastery begins with self-knowledge of mind, body, and spirit, and expands into mastery of the forces that shape reality. He encourages modern listeners to emulate the ancestors by studying both the sciences and spiritual systems as complementary paths. In Kemet, he says, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, architecture, ethics, and ritual were integrated into a way of life and social order designed to produce balanced, service-oriented human beings. In Browder's account, the ancient Cometians used the term Africa to denote the birthplace of humanity, culture, and civilization. He contrasts this with Europe's colder, harsher climates, arguing that such environments shaped different physical adaptations and survival strategies and did not initially foster the same kind of sustained technological, philosophical, and spiritual flowering found around the Nile. This is not to demean Europeans, he contends, but to emphasize how environment influences culture and development trajectories, and to dispel the myth that European experiences is the universal benchmark for human progress. Finally, Browder underscores the scale and priority of Africa's civilizational contributions. Long before any European reached African shores, Africans had founded complex societies, devised early timekeeping instruments, and created the first reliable calendars. Achievements required advanced observation, calculation, and metaphysical framing. His research program seeks to document these foundations and to demonstrate that many pillars of later world knowledge were laid by African ancestors. In his summation, Europe's subsequent advances were profoundly indebted to African instructions. Without that civilizing influence, he argues, Europeans would have remained living backwards. Browder's call is clear. Reclaim the African intellectual legacy, reintegrate science with spirit, and apply the synthesis to build human balanced societies today.